Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachary Renfro, and in today's lecture, we're going to learn a little bit about argument translation and argument assessment. But to help us translate and understand arguments, we have to learn a little bit of symbolic logic. That way, once we've translated an argument, we know how to assess it. The symbolic logic will also help us with the translation process of the argument. So in our last video, we talked about validity and soundness. Validity relating to the structure of an argument and soundness relating to the truth value of the propositions. So let's explain that in a little bit more detail. We learned about the standard form, P, then Q, therefore P and Q, right? That's just a way of taking any arbitrary statement and lining it up such that it's easier for us to assess it. So let's look at a simple example. The prince went dancing. The queen went dancing. Therefore, the prince and the queen went dancing. We can see that's a valid argument because if it's true that the prince went dancing and it's true that the queen went dancing, then it would be true that the prince and queen went dancing. However, let's look at an invalid argument. Let's look at one where it doesn't follow from that. This one's invalid because there's no relation between the premises and the conclusion. The prince went dancing. The queen went dancing, therefore Robert went dancing. You can see there's no connection between these premises. It could be the case that all of these are true, but it doesn't follow from one to the next that there's any relation. Validity is the idea that it is impossible for a valid argument's premises to all be true and the conclusion to be false. The reason that is because the conclusion follows directly from the premises. So let's look at some different types of examples where the premises and conclusion will have different truth values. Some of these might lead to valid arguments. Then we'll look at the example that immediately leads to an invalid argument. So if we have the case, we got a P and a C up here. If we have the case that all the premises are true and the conclusion's true, it's valid. If we have a case that all the premises are false and the conclusion is false, it's also valid. If we have a case that all the premises are false and the conclusion is true, it's still valid, right? Because what validity checks for is the relation between the premises and the conclusion. If we have a case that some premises are true and some are false, and the conclusion is true, it's still valid. And if we have a case that some are true, some are false, and the conclusion is false, it's still valid. Because again, what we're checking for is that what follows from the premises leads to the conclusion. Now, let's look at the case that all the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. That is an invalid argument. So this one down here at the bottom is invalid. We'll make a note. Invalid. And that'll help remind us what is valid and what is invalid. And this is just based on the structure alone. There are other ways that we'll be able to learn if something's valid or invalid a little bit later, but this is the structure-based argument, right? So let's look at this one. If it were true that the prince went dancing and the queen went dancing, and it was false that the prince and queen went dancing, well, then we can immediately see that that's an invalid argument. Now, I would recommend as we go through this lecture that you get out your pencil and paper or your favorite writing utensil and some paper, and you take notes and perhaps even pause along the way because some of these ideas can get pretty complicated. And because of the large number of them, we do have to move kind of quickly. So take a second, get out something to write with, and continue the video whenever you're ready. Next, we're going to learn a little bit about sentence translation, and this is going to help us when it comes to understanding how we can translate sentences into the standard form. I've got here some different words. This isn't all the possible ways that they can be translated, but it's to help you kind of understand the idea behind them. So let's start with the arrow. That stands for if-then. So if an argument could be set up in an if-then format, you would use the arrow. You've got the caret, or the V, that stands for or. You've got the upside down caret, which stands for and. You have the double arrow, which means if and only if. You have the negation or the minus sign, which means not. You have the equal sign, which just means equals. You have the double negation or not not. You have parentheses, which you can use to separate bits of argument. You'll see some of those in a bit. Then you have capital letters and lowercase letters. P, Q, R, or any capital letter, even Greek letters such as phi and psi. Phi and psi. Those stand for sentences or ideas. Whereas lowercase letters, such as this little e, a, and b, those stand for specific names of persons. So write these down, make sure you've got them in your notes, and we'll move on to the next section. All right, so we have some special rules and special translational notes for the arrow that I think will really help you. So starting out down here at the bottom, the arrow is only false if it's the case that phi is true and psi is false. So if we've got phi, therefore psi, this would only be false if phi is true and psi is false. And the reason for that is because the arrow shows the direct relation between the two premises, right? If you are wet, then it is raining, right? If you go out in the rain, then you will get wet. It could be the case that you went out in the rain and then you got wet. It could also be the case that you didn't go out in the rain and you didn't get wet. Those are both true. Could also be the case that you didn't go out in the rain, but you still got wet. Maybe you slipped in your bathtub. But it would be false if you went out in the rain and then you did not get wet, right? So that's how the arrow works. So let's talk a little bit more about some translational rules for the arrow. So it typically goes if then. If you see the if, then that goes before the antecedent, right? So you've got the antecedent phi, the consequent psi. So you'll put the arrow before it. However, if you see only if, you put it before the consequence. So you'll get wet only if you go out in the rain. When you translate that out, it would translate like this. You'll get wet only if you go out in the rain, right? Then we've got unless, phi, unless psi, and it can translate out into three different ways. 1, 2, 3. Could be the case that you have not psi, therefore phi. Could be the case that you have phi or psi, or it could be the case that you have not psi, therefore phi. So let's put this in an argument. Phi unless psi. So let's do an example. Let's say you'll get in trouble unless you do your homework. So that could translate to if you don't do your homework, you'll get in trouble. You can do your homework, or you can get in trouble. Could also be the case that you don't get in trouble, therefore you did your homework. Could also be the case that you don't get in trouble, therefore you did your homework, right? So that's how unless can translate, three different ways. Now let's look at some other special cases. In case, L in case T. You'll have lunch in case you get in trouble. That's very simple, L then T. Then we've got assuming that, L assuming that T. You'll have lunch assuming that you get in trouble. So that means if you get in trouble, then you'll have lunch. Provided, L provided that T. You'll have lunch provided that you get in trouble. So you have trouble, therefore lunch. So that's how the arrow can translate out. I know it's a lot. Take a deep breath. You're going to be okay. And we're going to move on to the next section. Okay, now we're going to move on to some special rules for the double arrow, also called the biconditional. And I think now you made it this far, I think you're ready to know a little bit more about the arrow and the double arrow. The arrow is called the conditional. Phi on the condition of psi, right? So the two things have a relation. The double arrow is called the biconditional. So that means that both things imply each other in all cases. So it can be stated if and only if. It can be stated as just in case. And what it means, if you see the double arrow, is P biconditional Q. It means P, therefore Q, and Q, therefore P. So that's how that translates out. All right, I'm going to read to you a couple of sentences showing the biconditional just so you can see what it means. Interest rates will drop if and only if there is a recession. So interest rates and recession, interest rates will drop, therefore there's a recession. There's a recession, therefore interest rates will drop. Same thing, right? John will come to the party just in case the event that he finishes his paper. So John will come to the party, John finishes his paper. So if John comes to the party, then he finished his paper, and if he finished his paper, then he comes to the party. If and only if she doesn't have a date, Mary will come to the party. So Mary doesn't have a date, Mary will come to the party. Mary came to the party, Mary doesn't have a date, Mary doesn't have a date, Mary came to the party. The cat will play if she is fed, and she will not play if she's not fed. The cat will play if she's fed, she won't play if she's not fed. Cat will play, cat is fed, cat will play, right? So that's how the biconditional works. You don't see it a lot in standard English, and you don't see it a lot in regular arguments. You might see it in relation to things such as interest rates, such as the first example, but it's not a very common type of argument. Now, when it comes to the biconditional, it's only true if the two components are in truth agreement. So if the two things agree. So let's go through that. What I've got here is a truth table. This is a method of determining the validity of an argument based off of the truth values of the different things. You come about this using what's called a brute force technique. So you start with your two statements, P and Q, and then you want to list out all the possible truth values. P can be true twice, it can be false twice. Same for Q, but we need to switch up the order. So it can be the case that P is Q and Q is true. It can be the case that P is true and Q is false. It can be the case that P is false and Q is true. And it can be the case that they're both false, right? So that's how you work that out. And then taking from these two, then you apply them out to these different arguments. So let's look at the argument of P and Q. We're looking for when it's true. Well, P and Q is only true in the case that P and Q are both true. I went to the party and I ate queso, right? If I went to the party and I ate queso, they're both true. If I went to the party and didn't eat queso, it's false. If I ate queso but didn't go to the party, it's false. And if I didn't go to the party, didn't eat queso, they're both false. All right. Now let's look at this example. P and Q. P or Q. I went to the party or I ate queso. It could be the case that I went to the party and I ate queso. That's the inclusive P, in which case they're both true. Could be the case that I went to the party but I didn't eat queso, then it's true. Could be the case that I didn't go to the party but I did eat queso, in which case it's true. And it could be the case that I didn't go to the party and I didn't eat queso, therefore it's false. Now we've got the conditional. Could be the case that I went to the party and I ate queso, so it's true. But it would be false if I went to the party and I didn't eat queso, right? Because what this is showing the relationship between the party and the queso, right? If I went to the party, then I have to eat queso. If I go to the party, then I don't eat queso, then it's false. This is an or, this is an and, this shows the connection between the two. So let's see. I went to the party, but I didn't eat queso, so it's false. I didn't go to the party, but I did eat queso, so it's still true. And the reason it's still true is because this shows the connection between the two, right? It's just showing that if I go to a party, I'll eat queso. I could eat queso some other way, but that's what it shows. And then finally, I didn't go to the party. I didn't eat queso. Still true because it doesn't disprove this, right? Then finally, we've got our biconditional. I went to the party and I ate queso. It's true. Went to the party, didn't eat queso. False. Didn't go to the party, did eat queso. False. Didn't go to the party, didn't eat queso. It's true. The reason it's true is because it's showing the relationship between these two things, right? So we've got our conditional and our reverse conditional, and that's showing that these two things are always going to be the same. So if I go to the party, then I'll eat queso, and if I'm eating queso, then I went to the party. So that's some special rules for how we use the conditional and the biconditional, and that also explains truth tables. When you hear the statement X is true or Y is true or this statement is true or this statement is false, imagine, if you can, the truth table showing these different values of truthfulness and falseness. All right, so we just got finished learning some special rules for biconditionals, and we learned a little bit about truth tables. So now we're going to learn some different inference rules for arguments. So these are different types of arguments. You might see, as I go through them, I'm going to give, silly little pretend arguments to help you understand what it is I'm talking about. So first, the granddaddy of them all, the contradiction. This is an invalid argument. It's invalid, in fact, because it says A equals not A or A and not A. So for this argument, it would be something like apples are the same as not apples, which is nonsense, right? Then we've got tautology. This is an argument that's always true, but it doesn't mean anything in particular. So it would be apples are the same as apples, or everything's either an apple or it's not an apple, right? So those are two arguments that sometimes you will see. You'll see them on things such as Reddit posts or YouTube comments, So let's go on to some others. We've got the modus ponens. P then Q, P therefore Q. The prince went dancing, therefore the queen went dancing. The prince went dancing, the queen went dancing. Then we've got the modus tollens. The prince will go dancing if the queen goes dancing. The queen did not go dancing, therefore the prince didn't go dancing. Then we've got one of my favorites, the hypothetical syllogism. It goes P then Q, Q then R, P then R. I've heard some people call this an argument by chains. Basically, you're linking these premises together. You're showing how one relates to the other. So if the prince is alive, then the queen will wear red pants. If the queen wears red pants, then the Russians will invade. So if the prince is alive, the Russians will invade, right? So the hypothetical syllogism allows you to go from one specific thing all the way to another very specific thing, as long as you can show the connection between them. Then we've got disjunctive syllogism. P or Q, it's not P, therefore it's Q. The prince ate a steak, or the queen ate a steak. The prince didn't eat a steak, therefore the queen ate a steak. Then we've got the argument of addition. The prince is alive, therefore either the prince or the queen is alive. This isn't a very strong argument because you're tacking on an additional thing in your conclusion, but it is something you might see. Then you've got the argument of Simplification. There's a prince and a queen. Therefore, there's a prince. You'll see this sometimes when it relates to different products. There's an iPhone 16 and an iPhone 17. Therefore, there's an iPhone 17. Then we've got the argument of conjunction, very basic. There's a phone, there is a keyboard, therefore there's a phone and a keyboard. Then finally, we have the argument of resolution. This one can get a little bit tricky, so you do have to pay attention. Either the prince will go on vacation or the queen will go on vacation. If the prince doesn't go on vacation, then the Russians will invade. So either the queen will go on vacation or the Russians will invade. So you can see that this can set up some tricky arguments if you're not paying attention. So that is several different argument structures you might see. So we've learned a little bit about truth tables and conditionals. So let's go through a tricky example because I want you to see how sometimes people can lay out arguments in ways that will be very tricky to decipher and will lead to some pretty ridiculous outcomes. So for this argument, we're looking at prices falling and interest rates rising. So let's read through it. If prices fall, then interest rates will rise, and prices will fall, therefore interest rates will rise. So quite a tricky argument. Let's read through it one more time just to make sure we understand. If prices fall, then interest rates rise, and prices fall, therefore interest rates rise. So let's go through our truth table and break this down. So remember, we're using brute force to determine the truthfulness of this. So we've got 2 trues for prices falling, 2 falses for prices falling, and then we've got true, false for our interest rates rising. So let's work this out. Let's get a red marker. Prices fell, interest rates rose, true. Prices fell, interest rates didn't rise. So we'll circle that one as false. Prices didn't fall, but interest rates rose, true. Neither prices fell nor interest rates rose, true. Okay. Now let's look at the tricky part in the middle. Prices fell, therefore interest rates will rise, and prices fell. So it's true, prices fell, interest rates rose, and it's also true that prices fell, therefore interest rates rose, true. But then look at this. All these are false, so let's work through these. Prices fell, interest rates didn't rise, and prices didn't fall or rise, or prices fell, but interest rates didn't rise. So that's false. So prices didn't fall, but interest rates rose, which means that prices didn't fall, but interest rates rose. So that's false. And then we've got prices fell, interest rates didn't rise. That's true. But because this is false, it's still false. Okay, so now let's look at our final one, our trickiest part of the argument, which is the whole thing put together. Prices fell, prices will fall, therefore interest rates will rise, and prices fell, therefore interest rates will rise. So let's work this out. So in this case, it's all true. Prices fell, interest rates rose, yada, yada, yada. But look what happens here with our antecedent. It's false. Prices didn't fall, interest rates didn't rise, and prices didn't fall. But our consequent is also false, which means this is true. Now look at this one. Prices didn't fall, and interest rates didn't rise, and prices and interest rates rose. So that's true. And then finally, look at this one. Prices didn't fall, interest rates didn't rise, and prices didn't fall, and interest rates didn't rise. So that's true. So you can see with this tricky argument, which was kind of tricky to even say out loud, the person was able to set up an argument that was in the end true in every case. But we can see from looking at the argument that it's a bit of nonsense. However, if you're reading this in a 50-page economics article, you might not catch that at the beginning, right? So you have to, as you're reading, you have to go through, you do need to apply charity when you're reading arguments. You need to try and present them in the best possible light that you can. But you also have to realize that sometimes people may not understand the argument that they're presenting, or that they might be trying to intentionally deceive. So we talked a little bit about tricky arguments. Now I want to talk a little bit about universal and existential quantifiers. So if someone says a sentence such as, all cats have hair, or all dogs go to heaven, no dogs go to heaven, all cats speak Spanish, then how you'll translate that is either with an upside down A for all X, that's a universal quantifier, or with a backwards E, existential quantifier. That means for at least one, there exists at least one. So let's break this out with apples. So with our domain of discourse being apples, we've got it such that for all apples, if you're an apple, then you're a fruit. Therefore, all apples are fruits. Let's say no apples are fruits. For all apples, if you're an apple, then you're not a fruit. Or there doesn't exist even one thing that's an apple and a fruit. Now let's say some apples are fruit. You know, you've got wooden apples, you got wax apples. So there exists something such that it's an apple and it's a fruit. Now let's say some apples are not fruit. There exists something such that it's an apple and it's not a fruit. I know apple seems a little silly, but you could see this art, you could see existential and universal quantifiers in relation to anything. For example, you could read a sociology paper that says all people from the tribe of Quan are violent. You could read a technology article that says all large language models are smarter than humans. Or you could read something that said no large language models are smarter than humans, or perhaps some large language models are smarter than humans, right? So that is universal and existential quantifiers. So now I'm going to go over some very basic arguments when it comes to existential and universal generalizations. So first we've got the universal instantiation. All women are brave, therefore Cindy is brave. Then we've got the universal generalization, so it works in reverse. Cindy is brave, therefore all women are brave. Then we've got two different versions of the existential generalization. So there exists someone who is brave, Cindy is brave, therefore Cindy is brave. Or Cindy is brave, therefore there exists someone who is brave. These could also work with other things. There's someone who ran a mile, Sparky ran a mile. Sparky ran a mile, therefore there exists someone that ran a mile. All right, now let's go through some final notes that I wasn't able to work in anywhere at the end. These are all a little bit disjointed, but we'll go through them one by one. And remember, you need to be taking notes as I'm going through this because this stuff is complicated. And if you don't have your notes to look back on, you won't remember it. None of it will make sense, right? So starting with the difference between prescriptive versus descriptive statements. Prescriptive are typically ought statements or value statements. You ought not steal, murder is wrong, freedom is a basic value, human rights are good, right? Those are prescriptive statements. You're prescribing the same way that a doctor would prescribe something. Versus descriptive statements. These are either false or they're true. The cat is on the mat. 2 + 2 = 4. Fish live in water. Pigs don't fly, right? They are either false or they are true. Now, if you are taking an ethics or aesthetics class or some other things of philosophy, what they're trying to do is prove that some prescriptive statements are actually descriptive statements. So, for example, you look at utilitarianism, they say the morally right thing is the thing that provides the most good for the most people. They use rigorous logic on the back end to go through and say that this ought statement, doing the most good for the most people, is actually a descriptive statement, right? So you need to keep that in mind. And it's also the case that as you get further in other disciplines, you'll see that as well. Or there are some things which they claim are descriptive statements, but are actually just ought statements that have a very long history. For example, the idea that tax cuts are good for business, right? There can be cases where tax cuts are actually bad for business, but it has existed so long within the world of accounting and finance that it's taken to be a descriptive statement, right? When it's actually an ought statement. Tax cuts ought to help businesses. Now, going back to our ors, we talked a little bit about the biconditionals and conditionals. Well, there's a special thing you should know about ors that I didn't want to bring up till the end because, it could make a little bit of it confusing. You've got an inclusive or an exclusive or. Now, when I was going through the truth tables with you and I was explaining the truth and false values, that was in the inclusive sense, which means P is true, Q is true, or P and Q are true. So let's see how this would work. John won't call if he is working late or if his phone is dead. Well, it could be the case that he's working late. It could be the case that his phone is dead. Or it could be the case that he's working late and his phone is dead, right? So that's the inclusive or. But there's also an exclusive or. P is true or Q is true. You ate a sandwich or you ate a steak. You didn't eat both. You either ate the sandwich or you ate the steak. These work out with different truth values, but I was just showing the inclusive or because it's the easier one to kind of get your head around. Let's start with something called an argument tree. Now, this is different from truth trees in predicate logic. This is just a way to visually display an argument so that you know how it connects. So let's look at this very simple argument, P1, P2, C. Let's say Susan is a marathon runner. Susan eats healthy. Therefore, Susan is in good health. As you can see, the premises don't connect to each other, but they still support the conclusion. It wouldn't make sense for someone to be in good health if they were a marathon runner and they ate healthy. But let's look at a slightly different example. Willie is in the music club. No member of the music club plays jazz. Therefore, Willie doesn't play jazz. So you can see the first two premises actually have to support each other to connect to the conclusion. Willie's in the music club. No member of the music club plays jazz. Therefore, Willie doesn't play jazz. Now, let's look at a more complex argument. That way you can see how this works in a bit more detail. I'm going to have to read this argument off because it is a little bit tricky to keep in order. Consumption is increasing. The pound is weakening against other currencies. Therefore, inflation will increase. Whenever inflation increases, mortgage rates rise. Mortgage rates will rise. Whenever mortgage rates rise, the building trade suffers. Therefore, the building trade suffers. So how this works is we start with our first two premises. Consumption is increasing and the pound is weak against other currencies, which each support themselves and then tie to the first conclusion, which is that inflation will increase. Now, we've got inflation increasing, and when inflation increases, mortgage rates rise, which connect together to support the second conclusion that mortgage rates will rise. Then finally, we have mortgage rates rising and the building trade suffering, connecting together to support the final conclusion that the building trade will suffer, right? This is an argument that you very well could see in an argument about economics or in an argument about foreign trade, right? They'll lay it out in this case, starting with something that seems pretty far off to finally get to their conclusion. And then one final note, validity versus soundness. I know I said this at the beginning, but it bears repeating because this is very important. Validity deals with the structure of the argument. It just deals with the P's and the Q's and the C's, right? It deals with how the argument is shaped. Soundness deals with if the argument is actually true in the real world. That's the easiest way I can explain it. In various textbooks, you'll see a bunch of very complex definitions, but for me, that's the easiest way to remember. Validity deals with structure. Soundness deals with actual truth in the world, right? Just very simply, I'll give you an example of a valid argument. All presidents live in the White House. Laura Bush lives in the White House, therefore Laura Bush is a president, right? That's valid, but it's not sound, right? Because Laura Bush was never a US president. She was the wife of a president, right? That's how you can keep these two kind of separated and kind of understand how they apply to each other. If this lecture has been helpful to you, please leave a like, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you're one of my students in one of my classes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the forums, or I'd love to hear your thoughts during the weekly meetings. If you're someone watching this on YouTube, I encourage you, please talk about it in the comments. Logic and critical thinking, they are very, very tough. They're not easy subjects. You might have to watch through this video a couple of times and read through your notes. For example, for me making this video, I had a book, I had notes I had taken, I had another book that I'd printed, I had more notes that I'd taken, and I had some notes from some of my friends that I'd printed out, right? It is very complicated stuff. And just from my own personal experience, when I was doing my master's degree and I was taking a predicate logic course, the professor, Dr. Ehrlich, would often have a sheet of paper in front of him as he was writing these things on the board and talking about them, because it is so easy as you're going through them to get tongue-tied, to forget something, to get twisted up, because you have all these tiny individual pieces that fit together and can cause you a lot of trouble. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please let me know what you think. You have a wonderful day. Thank you. It could also be the case that you don't get in trouble because you, wait. Don't show me.
Oh, wow.
Oh.